Many of the most disturbing moments in human history have gone on to have a lasting impact on everything that came afterwards. Some are remembered, while others fade into obscurity. Historians have been unable to find much information on a girl named Abigail Williams, who was one of the first people ever to be accused of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials that occurred between February of 1692 and May of 1693. What is certain, though, is that she was born in July of 1680 in Salem, Massachusetts, and she was living with Reverend Samuel Parris, her uncle, and his daughter, Betty. It's believed that her parents had passed away, and so she had no choice but to move in with their extended family. At the time, locals were obsessed with identifying witches, and unfortunately, a game that Abigail would play with a few of her friends would result in her being accused of being involved with the occult. The game in question was called the Venus Glass, and it involved dropping egg whites into a glass of water, after which the resulting shapes were read in an effort to learn more about the men that they would marry one day. It was just a bit of fun, but before long, the girls started believing they could see the future. And on one occasion, where the shape of a coffin appeared in the glass, they became terrified that one of them would lose their lives shortly. It was now the start of the year, 1692, and that's when Abigail's troubles began. She and Betty both started having seizures, suffering from unexplained aches and pains, and claiming that they were being hounded by spirits that would pinch them when no one was looking. It didn't take long before the other girls in the group also started suffering from these same afflictions, and a month later, they were examined by Dr. William Griggs. After determining that they were healthy as ever, he drew the only conclusion that made sense at the time, that they'd been bewitched somehow. Reverend Parris asked him to keep his opinion to himself, out of fears that the girls would be prosecuted if news got out, but unbeknownst to him, one of his congregation members, a woman named Mary Sibley, spoke to a man named John Indian and explained to him how he could find out who had cursed the girls. This involved using ashes to bake a cake made out of rye meal and feeding it to a dog, but it isn't known how this was meant to identify a suspect. Nevertheless, the girls came forward just a few days later to report that they'd been bewitched by 3 local women, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. At the word of the girls, the 3 women were arrested and put on trial. Tituba confessed to being a witch and assured everyone in attendance she was only one of many witches living among Salem. She also added that the town had been taken over by the devil and that he was responsible for the locals' obsession with witchcraft. In the weeks that followed, many more people were put on trial for witchcraft after being accused by Abigail and her friends, one of whom was John Proctor, who'd maintained that the group of girls was lying about being bewitched. When all was said and done, Abigail had pointed fingers at as many as 57 people, but she only testified against 8 of them. She's last mentioned in the town's records on the 3rd of June, 1692, when she attended a trial, and after which no one is certain what became of her. It's been suggested that she was sent to live elsewhere to get her away from the witch mania. She was responsible for at least 15 people losing their lives thanks to her accusations, but no one knows where she went or what became of her after leaving Salem for good. Gaspar Corte Real is a well-known explorer who was born in 1450 in the Azores Islands, specifically in an area called Angra do Heroísmo. His family was part of Portuguese nobility, and his father served as the governor of Terceira, and an explorer who passed his love for exploration to Gaspar. As a young man, Gaspar received the best possible education, as he was sent to live with the Duke of Beja, who served as his teacher. Whenever his father and older brother were unable to, Gaspar served as governor, but he would also join his father on some of his expeditions. After his father passed away in 1496, Gaspar traveled to Portugal, where he visited with King Manuel, and he became enamored with the idea of exploration. Upon finding out that an area had been discovered that might fall within Portugal's boundaries, the king sent Gaspar out into the world to find new areas to explore and to look for the Northwest Passage that would give them access to Asia. Gaspar was happy to oblige, and in 1500 he set sail from Lisbon and headed to Greenland, which he mistakenly believed to be Asia. Upon arriving, he and his crew sailed along Greenland's coast, but they were forced to turn back due to thick ice in the ocean. The following year, he set out on his second expedition, accompanied by 2 other ships. He decided to take a different route, and this time landed in what is now Labrador. There, he discovered wild berries and pine trees, and he took 60 natives as slaves. 5 months later, one of the ships arrived back in Lisbon with 7 of the slaves aboard, but there was no sign of Gaspar or the other ship. His brothers started to fear the worst, but 3 days later, the second ship arrived. But Gaspar was not aboard this ship, and his brothers were then informed that the vessels had become separated while out at sea, and that they each had to find their own way back. Almost exactly a year after Gaspar left Lisbon, his brother Miguel decided to set sail to look for him. He took 3 ships and made his way to Newfoundland, where he and his men observed a series of coves, islets, rivers, and harbors. He believed that Gaspar's ship might be hidden in the area, and ordered that the fleet split up to search for him. They agreed to meet back up on the 20th of August, but when the day came, only 2 of the ships arrived. Miguel's ship was unaccounted for, and despite searches being carried out, he was never found. But it's been suggested that Miguel lived in Newfoundland for about 9 years after arriving there, though this has never been confirmed. Gaspar was also never found, and his fate remains unknown. The Chinese politician Lin Biao was born in the Hubei province of China in 1907, and he received his primary education at a local village school. Following this, he attended a school in Wuchang, starting there in 1921. At the time, China was in the midst of a social and cultural upheaval, and by all accounts, this had a profound impact on him. As a result, he developed an interest in politics, specifically communism and socialism. He joined China's Socialist Youth League in 1923, and 2 years later traveled to Canton, where he started studying at the Whampoa Academy. There, he joined the Chinese Communist Party, which was working with the Soviet Union and the nationalists against the country's warlords and imperialists. Thus, Biao was recruited by the Nationalist Army, and in 1926, he was part of the Northern Expedition that marched on the Yangtze River in an effort to overthrow the warlords. He proved himself as an excellent soldier, as he quickly rose through the ranks and became a battalion commander. But he was forced to flee, along with many of his fellow soldiers, when Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the expedition, suddenly switched sides in 1927. That same year, he took part in the Nanchang Uprising with his fellow communists, and soon became known as one of Mao Zedong's finest commanders. 5 years later, he attained the rank of Corps Commander, and by the age of 28, he'd become somewhat of a legendary figure since he'd never lost a single battle. He relocated to Shaanxi, where he became the president of the Red Army Academy. After World War II ended, he relocated to Manchuria and was made the commander of the 4th Field Army. He rallied people living in the countryside and slowly but surely gained the upper hand over his nationalist enemies. His army grew from 100,000 men to 8 times that number, and eventually he took Manchuria back from the nationalists, and before long, that party crumbled altogether. He then captured Beijing, Wuhan, and Guangzhou in 1949. By 1969, Biao was deeply ingrained in China's Cultural Revolution after rising the ranks of the Chinese Communist Party. It's largely thanks to Biao that Chairman Mao became an iconic figure in China, especially among the Red Guards, since he composed most of Mao's speeches and other writings. Since Biao was highly regarded in the military, he used his position to his advantage and suggested that China's constitution be amended. Thanks to this, he was named as Mao's successor, but it also likely led to his demise. Unbeknownst to him, Mao had started considering him a threat, and he decided it was time to get rid of Biao. Thanks to Chinese Communist Party propaganda, he was labeled a traitor to the revolution. According to official records, Biao decided to flee to the Soviet Union, and to do so, he boarded a plane on the 13th of September, 1981. But as the plane flew over Mongolia, it crashed into a field and everyone on board lost their lives. In the aftermath, it was claimed that Biao had been planning to assassinate Mao, but many people believe that it was he who was executed and that the plane was intentionally brought down. It's also been suggested he was never aboard the plane, but that he was executed in China, and the plane crash was used as an explanation for his sudden disappearance. The Great Devon Mystery, also known as the Mystery of the Devil's Footprints, has remained an unsolved mystery since its occurrence in 1855 in England. At the time, the area was experiencing unusually cold weather and snowfall, causing rivers in the area to freeze over. On the 8th of February that year, Devon experienced heavy snowfall, rain, and a strong wind that blew in from the east. This weather prevailed through the night, and the following morning, people started reporting something very unusual that they could not explain, but which caused them a great deal of concern. They'd come across footprints in the snow that on any other occasion may have been attributed to a large dog or a wolf, if it weren't for the fact that they were found on rooftops, narrow walls, gardens that were protected by high walls, and other inaccessible areas. Furthermore, the print seems to indicate that whatever creature had made them only had 2 legs instead of 4, as the prints led away in a single line. The villagers followed the prints and soon discovered that they'd also been seen in areas as far as 100 miles away on the same night. Almost immediately, superstition took over, and people started spreading a rumor that the devil was at work in Devon. Residents of the village of Dawlish reported that they followed the prints along the coast and that they eventually disappeared into the sea without explanation. In Exeter, a group of men, determined to find the creature, discovered a set of tracks and they followed them into a barn. They were certain that they had cornered the beast and that they would be able to put a stop to it, but the prints led them to a brick wall where they suddenly stopped, as if the creatures had simply walked straight through it. Church leaders only added fuel to the fire when they declared the prints to be the work of Satan, and this only exacerbated the situation as superstitions ran rife. Naturalist Dr. Edward Forbes traveled to the area to find a rational explanation, but he was unable to link the tracks to any known animal, and he concluded that they couldn't possibly have been made by a normal animal. Those with cooler heads suggested that the markings had been made in the snow by a meteorological event, or that a group of pranksters was trying to cause panic in Devon, but this did little to bring calm among the superstitious. One night, while locals were having a drink in a tavern, a local woman named Eliza Montague claimed she had seen the beast responsible for the prints when she was still a child. She claimed that she was walking home through the woods when she spotted a tall man in the distance, but she noticed there was something strange about his appearance. His cloak billowed behind him, but she noticed there was no breeze to be felt. As he approached her, she noticed that he had red glowing eyes and that he had hooves instead of human feet. She ran for her life, and thankfully the man didn't follow. When she turned around, he'd simply disappeared as if into thin air. In the days that followed, the prints would appear over and over again, and in desperation, a group of men followed them into the woods one night. They later stated that as they entered the woods, it suddenly got colder, and they noticed a strange aura of foreboding. They followed the prints to a clearing where they found a strange stone in the center, of which the prints suddenly stopped. The ground in the circle was warm to the touch, and suddenly a growl emerged from the soil, along with a strange trembling. They turned to run, but before they could, a tall, thin man stepped out from behind the trees, and they noticed that his eyes were glowing red. His cloven hooves were clearly visible, and he pointed at them, warning them to leave and never return. They reported that they fled for their lives and did return the following day, but the prints were gone, and they never appeared again, leaving the case of the devil's footprints an unexplained mystery. Thanks to an unfortunate accident that befell him in 1848, 25-year-old Phineas Gage has been hailed by many as the man who introduced the world to neuroscience, though he'll likely have gladly traded that title for a more normal life following the incident. At the time, Gage was working in Cavendish, Vermont, where he was employed as a railway worker, and he was in the process of clearing the way for new tracks to be laid. To do this, he used explosives to disintegrate the rocks that needed to be removed. He would drill a hole in each rock before packing it with an explosive charge with the use of a tamping iron, which is a 13-pound metal bar. There was nothing unusual about his technique, but on this day, the 13th of September, it resulted in a series of events that would change his life forever. While tamping down the explosives into one specific rock, the metal bar struck the side and caused a spark. This set the charge off prematurely, and the resulting explosion caused the metal bars to strike Gage in the face. His injury was horrific as the bar punctured his face beneath his eye socket before emerging at the top of his head. But miraculously, he survived. As is to be expected, the bar caused a massive amount of damage to his brain, specifically the frontal lobe. Despite this, he remained conscious and was able to walk unassisted to a cart while still talking to his fellow workers. He was loaded onto the cart and taken into town, where he was treated by a doctor. He remained conscious throughout and responded well to the doctor's questions, but he clearly had no idea how bad his injury really was, since he refused visits from his coworkers, stating that he would see them at work in a day or two. As was often the case with injuries back then, he developed an infection and slipped into a shallow coma, but he was able to get out of bed after waking up on the 7th of October, and his road to recovery had begun. A month later, he had recovered enough to leave his house, and he traveled to his parents' house in New Hampshire to recover fully. He returned the following year, and when he visited his doctor again, he'd lost vision in one eye, but seemed to have no other lingering effects from the accident. But this changed in the months that followed. Whereas Gage was a hard-working and friendly man before the incident, his personality started to change dramatically after his return. He was unable to hold down a job thanks to his unruly and aggressive nature, and he'd started drinking heavily. He'd use foul language without provocation, showed no patience towards anyone, including his friends, and was unable to stick to a plan once he had made it. This only caused him to become more irritable and belligerent. He told his doctor that he no longer was the same man, and he eventually decided to relocate to Santa Clara County, where he started working on a farm. There, he started suffering from seizures and would pass away on the 23rd of May, 1860. As science has advanced throughout the years, we've become aware of many types of allergies that are caused by ingredients in our food. Some people avoid dairy products since they're lactose intolerant, or carry an EpiPen in case they accidentally ingest peanuts that can cause their airways to close. But in one very strange case that took place in Massachusetts in 2020, a 37-year-old woman whose name has not been made public started acting strangely, and naturally it was discovered that it was because she was sensitive to gluten. At the time, the woman was studying for her PhD when she started suffering from strange hallucinations. She started believing that everyone around her was out to get her in one way or the other, and that the loved ones in her life were not being sincere towards her, but were rather acting out a script in which she was the protagonist. Within just a few days, her paranoia had gotten out of hand, and her personality started to change. She had started shoplifting, something that she would normally never dream of doing, and would start arguments with strangers for no reason. Her parents decided to take her to a psychiatric hospital where she was examined and diagnosed with a psychotic disorder, and she was prescribed antipsychotic medication, but it had no effect. A second visit to the hospital revealed that she was suffering from mineral and vitamin deficiency. She'd lost a lot of weight, and at last it was discovered that she was suffering from celiac disease. The disease has strange side effects that cause a person's immune system to attack their own tissues whenever gluten is ingested, and hence she was told to switch to a gluten-free diet. But her delusions had gotten so bad, she believed the doctors were part of the conspiracy against her, and she continued with her normal diet. As a result, her condition only worsened, and before long she lost her job and her house, and started refusing to speak to her family. She was eventually returned to the hospital and was convinced to follow the doctor's advice. Just 3 months later, she was back to normal and thanked the hospital staff for being patient with her. But on one occasion, she accidentally ingested gluten, and as a result, attempted to end the lives of both of her parents. She was arrested, put on trial, and eventually found guilty of attempted murder. According to her doctor, she never contacted the hospital again, and it isn't known whether she made a full recovery. But her strange case has helped doctors better understand the effects that gluten can have on someone who's gluten sensitive, though these studies are still in their infancy. Someone goes missing and is eventually found. They usually have quite the tale to tell. Some people simply get lost while hiking in the woods, or become confused while traveling in an unfamiliar area. But in some cases, the details are more disturbing, as they reveal that they've been kidnapped or have no memory of the time that they were gone. The case of the disappearance of 18-year-old Elizabeth Canning is one such case in which many questions remain unanswered. Elizabeth was born in London in 1734, and she left school when she was 15, choosing to start work as a maidservant instead. By the time that she was an adult, her father had passed away, and she, along with her mother and siblings, moved to a house at Aldermanbury. She eventually moved out and started living in a room in her employer, Edward Lyon's house. On the 1st of January, 1753, she left the house to visit her uncle, and when she failed to return that night, Lyon went to her mother's house to look for her, but she wasn't there. Her uncle stated that he and his wife last saw Elizabeth when they parted ways at the Aldgate Church at around 9:30 that night. Her mother placed notes all over the city asking for information on her whereabouts, but for the next few weeks, no further clues were found. A 2-guinea reward was offered to anyone who came forward with useful information, but this never happened. Then, on the 29th of January, she suddenly walked back into her mother's house. She was in bad condition, as her hands were blackened with dirt. She was dressed in only her shift, petticoat, and bedgown. And around her head she had a rag that was covered in biological material. She told her mother that on the day that she disappeared, she was walking home when she was attacked by 2 men in Moorfields. They took all the money she had on her, as well as her dress, apron, and hat, before gagging her with a handkerchief and tying her hands behind her back. She was then struck in the head, which resulted in a seizure, and she lost consciousness. When she woke up, she walked to a house owned by someone with the last name Wills or Wells, and there, a woman tried to convince her to become a street worker. When she refused, the woman became outraged and forced Elizabeth into an upstairs loft. She was not allowed to leave, and for almost a month she was kept captive and given just water and scraps of bread to eat. One day, she managed to remove some boards that had been put over a window, and she escaped. She ran 5 miles back to her mother's house, and when the incident was reported to the police, it was found that the house belonged to Susanna Wells, who was also known as Mother. When the house was searched, Elizabeth identified the woman who'd held her captive, and she was arrested, along with Mary Squires, who was also living in the building. Wells stated that she had never seen Elizabeth before, but another resident of the house, Virtue Hall, confirmed that Wells and Squires had taken her captive. But then the case took a strange turn. Hall suddenly did an about-turn and recanted her statement against the 2 women, and she was then arrested for having committed perjury. Wells and Squires were both found guilty, but many people remained skeptical about Elizabeth's claims. After further questioning, Elizabeth was then arrested for providing false testimony, and Squires was released, though Wells had to serve her entire sentence before being released. Elizabeth was found guilty of willful and corrupt perjury. She spent a month in prison and then relocated to New England, where she married and eventually passed away in 1773. To this day, no one knows what really happened to Elizabeth or where she was for that month that she went missing. One wouldn't consider England to be an area where large cats like panthers walk around freely, but these creatures have been spotted there more often than expected. While some of these reports have been debunked, several remain unexplained, including the case of the beast of Sydenham, in a suburb of London, England, where 36-year-old Tony Holder was living in 2005. It's normally a rather quiet area, but one afternoon at around 2:15 p.m., Tony went into his garden to look for his tabby cat. As he walked around the side of his house, he was shocked to find that his cat was being pinned down by a huge black panther-like animal that he estimated was at least 5 feet long. He immediately shouted at it, and upon noticing him, it let go of the cat and set its sights on Tony instead. It leaped at him in a single bound and hit him in the chest and knocked him to the ground. It sat on his chest looking down at him, and Tony stated that he could see the whites of its eyes and massive teeth just a few inches away from his face. He was terrified, but only got more scared when the creature started snarling at him, and Tony believed he was about to lose his life in the most improbable of ways. He squirmed and pushed at the huge cat, but it outweighed him, and he found that he was unable to move. He had visions of his family finding him deceased after being mauled by the animal, but he tried to keep calm nonetheless. His 11-year-old daughter would later reveal that she saw the entire incident from her bedroom window, though she didn't know what it was that had knocked him to the ground, after which it made a hasty retreat. He called for an ambulance and was treated for scratches at the scene, but then something unbelievable happened. While paramedics were tending to his injuries, the same cat walked by the scene again as if nothing had happened. The police were called and they raced to the scene, but when they arrived, the beast had disappeared once more. The area was sealed off, and investigators started a search, armed with tranquilizers and flashlights. They were unable to locate it, but shortly after, a man named Billy Rich contacted the police to report that he'd spotted it while looking out of his window at 5 a.m. He stated that it leapt across the road in front of his house and then headed towards Mayau Park. He described it as similar to a panther and dismissed suggestions that it may have been a fox or a Doberman. Most people who are familiar with the case of the murder of Thomas Edwin Bartlett in London in 1886 believe that his wife Adelaide was responsible, but it's never been proven and it remains a mystery to this day. Adelaide was born in Orleans, France in 1855, but at some point during her childhood, she was sent to Kingston upon Thames in England, where she lived with her aunt and uncle. In 1875, she met a grocer called Edwin Bartlett and they fell in love, eventually deciding to get married. Bartlett believed that Adelaide needed further education, and so he sent her to a boarding school to, quote, fill in the gaps, as he put it. Hence, they only saw each other during holiday periods, and only in 1877 did she return to their apartment, which was located above his grocery store in Herne Hill. But after Adelaide suffered a miscarriage, she lost all interest in having children, and the couple's relationship started to deteriorate. Adelaide started having affairs with several men, placing further strain on her marriage, and when Thomas's mother passed away, his father moved in with them. He started accusing Adelaide of having an affair with Thomas's brother, Frederick, but Thomas would have none of it and forced his father to recant his statement in front of a solicitor. Meanwhile, Thomas was struggling with health issues that stemmed from a visit to the dentist, during which his teeth were filed down instead of being extracted for reasons unknown. The couple met a minister named George Dyson in 1885, and they became close friends. He'd visit them at their residence often, and Thomas hired him to further Adelaide's education in Latin, geography, and history. The couple then moved to Pimlico, but ensured that Dyson could still visit by purchasing a season ticket that he could use to travel between Putney and Waterloo. On one occasion, a woman working for the couple's landlord walked into the room while Dyson and Adelaide were busy with a lesson, and she was shocked to see she was lying with her head on his knee. It would later come to light that the three agreed that in the event of Thomas's passing, she was to marry Dyson. In December of that year, Thomas was diagnosed with gastritis, but Adelaide asked for a second opinion out of fear that she'd be accused of poisoning her husband. A second doctor agreed with the initial diagnosis, and Thomas soon started recovering while Adelaide looked after him. On the 27th of December, 1885, Adelaide asked Dyson to buy some chloroform that she claimed was to be used to ease the pain caused by his rotting teeth. Dyson went to two separate chemists, acquired the chloroform, and then on the 29th of December, he handed 4 ounces of the chemical to Adelaide. Thomas had dental surgery on the 31st of December that year, and when it was completed, he was returned home with his wife. Adelaide had started sleeping at the foot of their bed to avoid Thomas's bad breath, and when she woke up later that night, she discovered he was no longer alive. She called their landlord and stated she tried to revive Thomas with brandy, but to no avail. When an autopsy was performed, the case took a sinister turn. It was discovered that Thomas had large amounts of chloroform in his stomach, despite there being no signs that he had swallowed it, since his mouth and throat were clear. Adelaide was arrested and charged with Thomas's murder. Dyson admitted to purchasing the chloroform, and he was charged as an accessory before the fact. Her trial, which took place the following year, captivated the country, and the courtroom overflowed with onlookers while dozens of people droned around outside the building. It was determined that Dyson would serve well as a witness against Adelaide, and so the charges against him were dropped. The defense argued that since there were no chemical burns on Thomas's throat, Adelaide couldn't possibly have forced him to ingest the chloroform, and she was found not guilty. Adelaide moved back to France, and Dyson was kicked out of the church as his relationship with a married woman had been exposed. Thomas's demise is a mystery that still baffles experts today, and we'll likely never know what truly transpired that night. At around 12:30 p.m. on the 23rd of April, 1960, a man named Edwin Smith was on his way home to his residence in Milwaukee. He was driving along North Plankington Avenue when he reached an area between Clybourne and St. Paul Avenues, where he heard something that chilled him to the bone. Over the drone of the car's engine, he could hear a woman screaming for help, and he immediately stopped to investigate. As he got out of the car, he realized that the screams were coming from a nearby alley, and he rushed over. There, he found 76-year-old Ida Lowry lying on the ground. She'd been badly assaulted, and when he tried to help her to her feet, she started screaming in pain. He decided to leave her there while he called the police, and after their arrival, she was taken to a hospital, but unfortunately she passed away from her injuries. The crime took the city by storm, as it was one of the most brutal in its history. Ida had been found walking along the street when she was pulled into an alley by an unknown man who assaulted her before fleeing. She described him as a big Caucasian man who she knew was employed at the bridge. She stated that she remained in the alley for about 15 minutes before her screams were heard by Smith, but couldn't remember much else. The alley was processed for clues, but none were found. Searches for the man were conducted, but since her description of him was vague, no suspects were identified. It was then discovered that Ida had become rather eccentric after her husband passed away in 1950, and that she was living in the Hotel Royale at the time that the attack took place. She was known to frequent alleyways where she would pick through trash cans looking for clothing and other items despite not needing them. Her only remaining family, her two sisters, had not seen her for weeks, and an elevator operator at the hotel reported that she left the building at about 10 p.m. that night, which was not unusual. A man who fit Ida's description of the attacker was questioned, as he was known to be a drunkard who had one stage worked at a railroad bridge, and when his apartment was searched, a set of clothes covered in biological material was found. When tests proved that the clothes didn't belong to Ida, he was no longer considered a suspect. When one of Ida's safety deposit boxes was checked, it was found to contain over $17,000 in cash, and no one could understand why she had constantly struggled to pay her $10 per week rent. One man stated that he may have attacked Ida while he was intoxicated, since he was prone to alcohol-induced amnesia, but his clothing also eliminated him as a suspect. Several other people were questioned, but no further suspects were ever named, and Ida's murder remains unsolved. Before electronic transfers became the standard banking method, money would be couriered through bearer bonds around London in order to keep the liquidity in the British financial system. Because bearer bonds entitled their holders to the amount mentioned on the certificate, without requiring proof of ownership, gaining access to large bonds was extremely easy for criminal syndicates. If robbers were meticulous enough, they'd be able to secure the bonds and withdraw the funds without alerting authorities. But if something went wrong and the bank became suspicious that the bonds had fallen into the hands of a syndicate, they would be voided and ultimately useless. The ease of acquiring the bonds and getting a substantial payout was mouthwatering to large criminal organizations who lay in wait for their opportunity to pounce. That day came on the 2nd of May, 1990, for one criminal conglomerate. The criminal group was clever in their approach. It was that day that John Goddard, a bonds courier who worked for the financial brokers Shepherds, would be ambushed and mugged. He was carrying a briefcase which was host to 301 bearer bonds, totaling £121.9 million, equivalent to £292 million today. £121.9 million of the documents were certificates of deposit, while the remaining sum was HM Treasury bills. A young-looking man popped up out of nowhere, held the courier at blade point, and demanded the briefcase from him. This event would become known as the biggest theft in British history. It appeared to be a simple opportunistic robbery, but in actuality, it was far more planned than that. This was the result of meticulous efforts by an organized crime group. The group, involving an IRA operative, a Swiss banker, and Henry Nunn, a corrupt lawyer with ties to the London underworld, thoroughly orchestrated the robbery. They hatched a plan to make it appear as though it was nothing more than a mugging, allowing them to make off with a great haul. The next step, if they were successful in not alerting the authorities to the fact that an organized crime group was involved, would be to launder the bonds as quickly as possible. Unfortunately for the syndicate, the Swiss connection fell through. Their efforts to launder the money had failed, and the criminal organization had to seek alternatives in the underworld. Through the grapevine, the New York Mafia caught wind of the city bonds robbery, and they wanted in. Conveniently, they were already in the process of laundering United States bonds right there in London. Previously known to have made false loan applications to support his affluent lifestyle, UK contact Keith Cheeseman was recruited. Cheeseman worked with other associates, including well-known gangster Ray Ketteridge. While the criminals were in the process of linking up, news broke of the robbery, in which the media reported a worthless haul. But they were mistaken. The banks had been feeding them false information, allowing them to stay one step ahead. They'd notified every other bank, following leads, and allowed the bonds to remain active, enabling them to track down the syndicate. The efforts of the FBI and Scotland Yard, of course, were unbeknownst to Nunn, Cheeseman, and Ketteridge. They counted up the bonds they'd gotten their hands on and found that there was £135 million more than what the Bank of England had initially reported. Believing that no one had caught on to the organized robbery, Cheeseman headed off to launder the bonds himself, but what a mistake that would prove to be. The FBI, along with the Scotland Yard, were hot on the trail, and over the next 18 months, 2 men involved in the burglary would be executed. One of them was the original thief, the man that held the courier at Blade Point, and the next was a gangland figure. Some of the bonds would later be discovered in 2 Miami telephone books, having been smuggled to Pablo Escobar, who used them as a guarantee to acquire more animals for his personal zoo. Known as the Queen of Tejano music, Selena Quintanilla Perez was a beloved American singer whose fluid voice dominated the Tejano genre, the fast accordion-based Latin dance music. The Texas native made her debut in the 80s and quickly became a best-selling artist, with one of her albums earning her the Grammy for Best Mexican-American Album in 1994. Fans revered Selena as the Latin Madonna, who achieved great success as a solo artist. But this success would be grimly cut short by someone that Selena knew and trusted. Yolanda Saldivar, a San Antonio resident, initially disliked Selena after she won awards for which Salvador's favorite musicians were nominated. That hatred, though, changed in 1991, when she and her niece attended one of the concerts. Subsequently, Saldivar became quite the fan of Selena. The very next day, after initially seeing her perform live, the woman scoured the stands, hoping to find a souvenir of the event. Her searches were fruitless, but it did give her the idea of starting a Selena fan club in San Antonio to promote her newfound favorite singer. Saldivar contacted Selena's father, Abraham, who introduced his daughter to the music scene. According to him, messages from Saldivar began to rack up one after the other, and eventually he looked at them. The woman was presenting the idea of starting a fan club for his daughter, and so he agreed to meet her to discuss the idea. Abraham approved the idea, and Saldivar became not only the founder, but also the president of the San Antonio-based Selena fan club that June. That same year, in 1991, she would acquire her license as a Texas registered nurse. As the president of the fan club, she was responsible for membership benefits and for collecting $22 in exchange for Selena products. Proceeds of the club were allocated to charities. As the fan club progressed and Saldivar became more ingrained in the singer's life, the two became close friends. It didn't take long for the entire Quintanilla family to get to know her and subsequently form a trusting relationship. For the next 4 years, that trust would only build. But as they say, you're more likely to be slain by someone you know than by a stranger. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Selena Quintanilla Perez's ultimate homicide. After Selena and her family established 2 boutiques in 1994, called Selena ETC, Saldivar was seen as a potential candidate to run those businesses. In January, she was named as manager and authorized to write and cash checks, as well as have access to the accounts associated with the fan club and the 2 boutiques. Everything seemed to be going well until early 1995 rolled around, and some angry fans alerted the Quintanillas to something strange. Abraham began receiving complaints from fans who stated they'd sent money to the fan club but received nothing in return. After attempting to check the fan club's bank statements, Abraham found they didn't exist. An investigation ensued and revealed that Saldivar had been writing checks to herself from both businesses. Once the embezzlement was exposed, Selena and her family confronted her, and she was fired on the spot. It was then that something in Saldivar snapped. The very next day, the angered woman had to be forcibly removed from Q Productions after attempting to harass Selena there. She also spoke with the singer via telephone, and the two argued. Things seemed to go quiet for a bit after that, until the 10th of March, when Saldivar allegedly purchased a 5-shot stub-nosed revolver and used 5 hollow points as ammo. 3 days later, she contacted Selena, who still wanted to patch things up, and the two arranged to meet in a parking lot. When the concept of the missing bank statements was brought up again, Saldivar's plan was back in action. On the morning of the 31st of March, 1995, Saldivar called Selena and arranged another meetup at a Days Inn, the motel she was staying at. The two would later head to an alleged doctor's appointment and were heading back to the motel at around 10 a.m., which is when Selena contacted her husband, Chris Perez, who reminded her of the appointment at Q Productions. The singer said she would take care of one last item of business and would arrive soon after, but that would be the last time that Chris or the Quintanillas would hear from her. As soon as they were back at the motel, Selena and Saldivar began to argue, during which the celebrity told the former fan club president that she could no longer be trusted and demanded that her financial papers be returned. It was right then and there that Saldivar drew her revolver and fired at Selena's right shoulder, puncturing an artery after running into the lobby and screaming for help. She managed to identify her attacker to the bystanders and even gave her room number. Selena was mortally wounded and would barely make it out of the motel alive. Paramedics desperately tried to stabilize Selena at the scene, applying a topical dressing to stop the surface flow of vital fluid. After 50 minutes of trying to save her life, doctors in the trauma unit realized the damage was irreparable. At 1:05 that afternoon, at the age of 23 years old, Selena was pronounced deceased. It was November of 1990 in the municipality of Finland when Helena Marilainen headed off to visit a friend. She spent the evening at her friend's apartment and decided to leave in the dead of night to make the trip back home. It was around midnight when she walked off into the darkness, heading straight to the railway station where she would catch a train home. But as Helena stood on the platform awaiting the train, something dark was lingering in the shadows. A few minutes in, she was approached by a man with dark hair dressed in a leather jacket. He asked Helena where she was going, and she told him that she was catching a train back home. The man was quick to offer the woman a ride, and she trustingly agreed. The pair walked to the man's vehicle together, and after climbing into the car, the stranger offered Helena a drink, one that was supposedly alcoholic. She took it, a mistake that would become apparent as the night unfolded. As they drove, the woman noticed how eerily quiet the man was, but her instincts were pushed aside when she noticed the baby seat in the back. It wasn't long before Helena began to feel drowsy though, and eventually fell asleep, despite her efforts to fight it. When she awoke, she discovered they were no longer heading for her hometown, but were now somewhere in the middle of nowhere, driving down a small road. Unnerved, she asked the driver where they were going, and despite his reassurance that they were still heading to their initial destination, Helena couldn't help but feel that something was amiss. Eventually, the car came to a stop at a gravel pit and turned off. The stranger tried to get Helena to spend the remainder of the evening in the car because it was so late, but she insisted that she wanted to go home. The man stated that he needed to use the bathroom and left the car. Helena did the same. As she wandered into the bushes, though, the stranger pounced. Sharpened blade in hand, he would strike at her. Despite her gushing wound and being caught by surprise, she managed a burst of energy and made a run for the woods. As Helena became more entangled in the forested area, she could hear the man saying, "That didn't work this time," before driving off. Those words would become incredibly distressing some years later. After some running, the now distraught and wounded woman managed to find a house, and the cops were at the scene immediately. Helena survived the attack and escaped with nothing more than a flesh wound, but others wouldn't be so lucky. It turned out this wasn't the only time, nor the last, that a similar-looking man had struck in the area. Helena's abduction was just one of the first incidents attributed to one individual, the Jarvin Paw serial slayer. the man responsible for a slew of unsolved violent crimes that would become known as the Gravel Pit Homicides. It's often a procedure for corporations that deal with large sums of money to conduct background checks on those they employ and on those they trust with those big wads of cash. Despite this being routine and thorough, some bad apples still slip through. Such was the case back in 1997 with the infamous Loomis Fargo robbery. David Gant found himself working for Loomis Fargo & Co. Armored Cars. He held the position of vault supervisor for the company that managed the transportation of large sums of cash, which was carted from bank to bank in North Carolina. Having served as a Gulf War veteran, the then-married David never found himself in trouble with the law, which gave him a squeaky clean background that helped him get hired. Although he worked for a company that saw a regular influx of millions, he was underpaid, a contributing factor to his rash decision. One day, while at work, David would begin a relationship with another employee, unbeknownst to his wife. Her name was Kelly Campbell, and she denies any romantic involvement, but the FBI has evidence that states otherwise. While chatting with an old friend and a small-time crook named Steve Chambers, he suggested that they rob Loomis Fargo. Campbell was accepting to this idea, receptive enough to bring it up to the vault supervisor, David. Making just $8 an hour, he saw the perfect opportunity for a change. Together, they hatched the following poorly planned scheme. David was to remain in the vault after his shift on the evening of the desired date, which was the 4th of October of that year. He would then need to let his companions into the vault, and they would proceed to load as much cash as they possibly could into their getaway van. David would then grab $50,000, the amount he could legally carry across the border without raising questions, and he would head for Mexico. Chambers would be the one to hold the remaining cash, which he would wire to David when needed, and once things had cooled off, he'd head back to Jacksonville, Florida, and they would split the haul properly. The plan sounded too simple, one that didn't take into consideration any other security measures, but unexpectedly, the heist went unusually well. On the 4th of October, David's shift was drawing to an end. He sent home the new employee that he was responsible for and disabled 2 of the security cameras, overlooking a 3rd one. That forgotten camera would capture exactly what happened next. The 2 accomplices showed up and soon discovered an issue with their plan: the weight of the cash. They'd underestimated the physical challenge involved in transporting massive amounts of money. To combat this, they simply began tossing wads of cash into the back of the van until they couldn't fit anymore. Although they were left with less than they intended to, they still made away with $17 million. David took off for Mexico, and the other 2 went into hiding. The following morning, Loomis Fargo employees flocked into work and found that the vault couldn't be opened. They called the police and reviewed the security footage together. While 2 tapes were missing, the 3rd allowed the robbery to be an open and shut case. Campbell and Chambers were easy to catch, while David's capture took a bit more time. The vault supervisor was once a well-liked employee, a veteran whose subsequent inside job actions only cast negative light on a disturbing truth. No one can be trusted. It was 1996 when the worst event struck Australia, forever marring the history of Tasmania. It was the morning of the 28th of April when Martin Bryant finally snapped. Just a few short years prior, his father tried to purchase the well-known bed and breakfast, Seascape Cottage, located in Port Arthur, a tourist destination. Unfortunately, he was beaten to the deal by David and Sally Martin. Bryant's father would later pass away as a result of his depression, which his son believed to have been caused by the missed opportunity. The 26-year-old, grief-stricken man made his way to the home of David and Sally, the pair that refused to resell the guest house, and he drew his firearm and ended both of their lives. He took the keys to Seascape, along with the weapons owned by the Martins, and climbed into his yellow Volvo 244, bound for Port Arthur. Along his journey, he was forced to pull over due to his vehicle overheating. During this stop, he met 2 people who suggested that he meet them at a cafe for a drink. That cafe ended up being another Martins-owned business located on Palmer's Lookout Road. After this, with a misshapen sports bag in tow, he headed for another cafe, the Broad Arrow, where he would have some lunch. Broad Arrow was situated at the historic tourist site of the Port Arthur prison colony. After having lunch out on the deck, he then headed into the busy restaurant side and placed his bag on the table. From it, he drew his Colt AR-15 rifle, and a hail of lead would follow. After having slain 22 people in quick succession of just 75 to 105 seconds, he left the restaurant and headed to the parking lot where his homicidal spree continued. Here, he would claim the lives of 4 tour bus drivers, their passengers, and some bystanders. On his way out of the parking lot, another slew of slugs sprayed out. This time, he wounded 4 people who were driving a BMW. From there, the Volvo rolled to a nearby gas station where Bryant saw the opportunity to fire at another victim and take a stranger hostage. With his prisoner in convoy, his next stop would be the Seascape Cottage. By now, police had caught wind of the unexpected event that now gripped Port Arthur. As he drove toward the bed and breakfast, Bryant's rampage wasn't over. He leaned his firearm out the window and fired upon passing cars on his way there, injuring the occupants or damaging their vehicles. He left nothing but carnage in his wake, leaving also a trail for both paramedics and law enforcement to follow. As he arrived at Seascape at 1:55 p.m., Bryant removed his captive, Glenn Pierce, from the back and took him inside. He handcuffed him to the railing of the staircase and returned to his car. He doused the Volvo in fuel and set it alight. By 1400 hours, 2 constables were on the scene, hoping to place the rampaging assailant in handcuffs, but they would soon discover that this was a greater challenge than they were equipped to handle. Bryant attempted to fire at the officers, but failed to injure either of them. The instability of the situation drew more police to the scene, and soon the area was surrounded. For the next 18 hours, a standoff would ensue. During the event, Bryant claimed that his hostage, as well as the Martins, were all still alive, but this was a lie. The Martins were his first victims that fateful morning, with Glenn having been slain sometime during the standoff. During the 18 hours, Bryant would fire at least 250 times at the officers, with only a brief rest between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. the following morning, on the 29th of April. At around 7:45, smoke began to emanate from the cottage, the result of a fire allegedly started by the perpetrator. Ammunition located in a storage area also caught fire, leading Bryant to burst out of the property with his clothes ablaze. Once the flames were doused, he fell to his knees, allowing the police to move in. He was arrested, and the Port Arthur massacre had ceased. It was the 17th of May, 1997, in Webster, Texas. Standing at a convenience store payphone was 19-year-old Sandra Sapoff, who rang a friend and told her to meet at a Waffle House. As she stood there, the young woman couldn't help but feel that she was being watched. It was then that she noticed a strange man in the parking lot, staring at her from his pickup truck. Not thinking too much of it, Sandra climbed into her car and proceeded across the street to the restaurant. As she arrived, she noticed that something was amiss. Her car tire was flat. Conveniently, the same man from the parking lot of the convenience store rolled up and offered help. Sandra agreed, and the man hopped out of his truck to inspect the damage. He then requested that the woman retrieve a bag from the front seat of his car. As she did so, Sandra would become overcome with a sense of dread. This was because the man, armed with a sharpened blade, had come up behind her, demanding that she comply, and if she didn't, she wouldn't leave this hospital parking lot alive. Sandra was forced into the truck, and they headed off north on I-45. During the drive, the stranger made several attempts to assault his victim, but realizing she was in danger, Sandra managed to leap from the moving vehicle and made a run for it. They hadn't gotten far, so the woman was able to run the short distance back to the Waffle House, and it was from there that the first description of the kidnapper would be made to the police. An employee at the restaurant comforted a distraught Sandra while on the phone with 911. She told them that they needed to come to Waffle House, claiming someone had just been kidnapped but escaped. It was a Caucasian male, somewhere in his 30s with blonde hair and a beard. At the same time the kidnapping had taken place, police were already searching for a suspect involved in a homicide case, the victim being Laura Smither, an aspiring professional ballerina. 300 miles away from where Smither was abducted and slain, another young woman, 20-year-old Kelly Cox, was also abducted and met a similar fate. 11 days later, officers in Bethany, Oklahoma, spotted an abandoned sedan which was host to some suspicious conditions. The very next day, the owner of that car was found. Her name was Tiffany Johnston, the victim of strangulation. As the case of the abducted and slain girls began to progress, police would narrow in on a suspect. His name was William Reece, a divorced truck driver and construction worker. Reece had a previous conviction from the 80s for 2 assaults and a kidnapping. Confirmation about his involvement in these cases wouldn't be until the only surviving victim, Sandra, revealed more details. The Webster Police Department enlisted the aid of a detective who was trained in hypnosis. She would help Sandra recall some details that she may have forgotten after her traumatic experience. When that hypnosis-trained detective later caught wind of details regarding Reece, she had a disturbing realization. The police department's suspect in the homicides was the same person that Sandra had described. Once the woman had recovered enough, Reece was brought into a lineup among other men. Sandra pointed right at him. That was the man who kidnapped her. The identification of the assailant enabled police to make the necessary connections to the other cases and subsequently arrest him. William Scott Scurlock's upbringing was nothing out of the ordinary. He was raised by religious parents in Virginia and stood out as a bright student. Through his studies of organic chemistry and biochemistry, he would learn how to make methamphetamine, which he would then sell. Eventually, through his illegal narcotics business, he was able to acquire enough cash to purchase a plot of land where he would build a 3-story treehouse. It had 30 windows, electricity, plumbing, a kitchen, bathroom, and even a fireplace. It was also rickety and unauthorized. But it wasn't Scurlock's narcotic endeavors and treehouse building fiascos that earned him a spot in history's most notorious criminals list. In 1990, he was dealt a serious emotional blow when his distributor was slain. It was a rude awakening for Scurlock, who realized he needed to get out of the narcotics trade. But his sights landed on something else. Starting in 1992, he earned the nickname Hollywood Bandit through his numerous bank robberies that he successfully orchestrated. He and his accomplices stole no less than $2.3 million from 17 banks across the Seattle area, making him one of the most notorious bank robbers known in American history. During each of these robberies, Scurlock would be camouflaged by the most elaborate disguises, leaving very few clues as to his true identity. His ability to evade capture was unusual, and his clean criminal record made it even simpler. Although he carried a firearm, Scurlock would never use it, and without injuring anyone, he would leave these banks with pockets full of cash. By the mid-1990s, though, his luck would begin to run out as the FBI zeroed in. Investigators combed through surveillance footage and pinpointed every detail. Their eyes soon landed on a potential suspect. They were able to determine that Scurlock was spending around $20,000 each month, with the date of the robberies correlating with the times he was expected to be low on cash. With this narrative in mind, the FBI began placing agents at the banks, hoping for confirmation and to move in on an arrest. But even then, the Hollywood Bandit evaded them. By 1996, Scurlock and his crew had robbed nearly 20 banks, and that year, he had his eyes set on another. The Seafirst Bank robbery would ultimately be his undoing. During the robbery, one of the bank tellers, recognizing the costume of the Hollywood Bandit, triggered a silent alarm, alerting authorities that something was amiss. As the criminal group was making off with their haul, one brave bank customer followed them and was able to report the getaway vehicle's details. Officers began tailing the suspicious vehicle. Scurlock quickly realized what was happening and did something most unexpected. He stopped the van. Then he did something he'd never done before. He drew his firearm, this time with the intention of using it. He fired at the officers and then climbed back into the vehicle and sped off. He intentionally crashed into a nearby house and fled on foot. Scurlock left some of his crew behind, allowing them to be arrested. They implicated him as the mastermind behind it all, and for the next several hours, the hunt for William Scott Scurlock was on. The following day, 2 brothers had visited their mother, whose home was just 2 blocks away from where the van was abandoned. Having heard of the manhunt, they began to suspect that someone may be living in a camper owned by their mother. They peered inside only to find a stranger. They quickly alerted authorities, who surrounded the camper within minutes, and finally, Scurlock, the notorious Hollywood Bandit, was cornered. It was the 20th of December, 1996, when a passerby spotted an amorphous scene near the Lake Stanley Draper shoreline. Upon closer inspection, they would have a disturbing realization. The unclear shape was actually a body. Law enforcement flocked to the scene, hoping that their suspicions wouldn't be confirmed. Those suspicions were related to a disappearance that had occurred just a day earlier. Unfortunately, they were right. The body was that of a missing 21-year-old, Julie Buskin, a Benton, Arkansas resident and a ballet student at the University of Oklahoma. Julie had just completed her final semester and was supposed to graduate at a later date. As she awaited that day, she would return to her parents' home, where she could enroll in a master's teaching program. Julie was expected to arrive on the 20th of December, the very day of her disappearance. The evening before, she and her college friends gathered to exchange Christmas presents and bid each other farewell. She would spend the remainder of the evening with Megan Schreck at her West Lindsay Street home. The following morning, Julie took Megan to the Will Rogers Airport and returned to her own apartment. That airport drop-off marked the last time that anyone would see her alive. Still in the early hours of the morning, 3 individuals would bear witness to an alarming event. At around 5:30 a.m., in the vicinity of Julie's apartment, a scream of terror rang out. Despite some investigation by those 3 bystanders, nothing suspicious could be found. So the morning drew on. At 11 a.m., a close friend of Julie's, Ryan James, arrived at the apartment, and they were due to have lunch together. Upon arriving there, Ryan immediately noticed something out of the ordinary. Julie's car was gone. He left for work and returned at 4 p.m., hoping his friend was back, but there was nothing. Concerned, Ryan and some of his family members began the lengthy search for Julie. They looked everywhere, including the airport, but there was nothing. A missing person report was soon filed and a search was initiated. At noon, the search would be called off when Randy Langford, a fisherman, made that startling discovery on the shoreline. Julie had sustained a single wound to her head, the direct cause of her demise. Bruises stained her face and lower body and were also accompanied by something unexpected: DNA. Forensic analysts had managed to obtain DNA from the victim's body that they believed belonged to the person who abruptly ended her life. Although they had the evidence, they couldn't link it to anyone, and so Julie's case went eerily cold, with the unidentified slayer being named John Doe. For the next few years, investigators would summon several suspects to the apartment and gather their DNA, hoping to match one of them to the crime. 7 men who lived nearby were investigated from 1997 to 2004. None of them matched. Police would then take a different approach and look into already convicted criminals. In July of 2004, they finally had a match. The DNA seemingly belonged to 25-year-old convicted burglar Anthony Castillo Sanchez. Residents of Los Angeles stumbled out of bed on the morning of the 28th of February, 1997, beginning their routines, not knowing that a disturbing event was about to unfold right before their very eyes. As they congregated in the streets of North Hollywood, the inhabitants would find their routine day was about to get a lot more exciting. It was at that very morning that 2 notorious bank robbers, Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasereno, planned to storm the Bank of America located at 6600 Laurel Canyon Boulevard. It was a meticulously planned robbery, one that they'd spend months preparing for. The pair were not your average robbers. Just a small revolver and a ski mask weren't enough for them. They had to go all out. Dressed in homemade body armor and armed with a cache of rifles, including fully automatic weapons that had been modified illegally, Phillips and Matasereno entered the back, fully expecting they would be exchanging lead with the police. For the next 44 minutes that day, a harrowing firefight would commence between the robbers and the police officers, who were woefully outmatched. Bystanders ducked for cover behind cars, ran back into buildings, sought shelter in nearby shops as shell casings ricocheted around the street. At the time, police were equipped with nothing more than 9mm ammo and .38 Special pistols. Only a handful of them were equipped with 12 gauges. It was clear that these weapons would be ineffective against the opposition's equipment. The LAPD wasn't just outmatched in firepower, but also in range. Their firearms just couldn't make the distance and proved insufficient for long-distance engagement. officers became increasingly aware of the dire situation they were faced with. There was simply nothing they could do. In a desperate move to counter the threat, a few of the officers headed to a nearby firearms shop where they commandeered AR-15 style rifles, hoping that these firearms would give them a chance. More than 15 minutes into the firefight, LA SWAT units arrived and were armed with AR-15s too. Still, they were faced with a challenge. The body armor the two assailants wore covered all vital areas they could be aimed at. Eventually, though, the SWAT units gained the upper hand, striking Phillips several times. Officers moved in to cuff and secure the body, and eventually, Mata Sereno was down too and succumbed to a loss of vital fluid. After 44 minutes, silence gripped the streets of North Hollywood. Bystanders emerged from their hiding places to see the carnage that had been left behind. Speaking of lengthy standoffs, no event can compare to one of the most notorious and disturbing massacres that took place in the 1990s, known as the Waco Siege. In the early 1990s, David Koresh, a long-haired man described as charismatic, had steeped himself in the belief that the end of the world was imminent. So he formed a Texas-based offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church named the Branch Davidians. The Davidians would live on a compound known as Mount Carmel, just 20 miles from Waco, Texas. Although they were considered a cult, law enforcement viewed them as relatively benign. Each to their own, they suggested. But when Koresh supposedly began taking spiritual wives, several of whom were not of age, he began attracting some attention. The launch of his retail firearm business also didn't dissuade surveillance. In 1993, suspicion about what the religious group was up to was on the rise, leading the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to suspect something major was going on. That suspicion was that the Branch Davidians were stockpiling weapons and illegally converting semi-automatics into fully automatics. After not-so-undercover surveillance confirmed their guesses, the ATF orchestrated a siege on the compound. Despite several flaws in the plan, and the fact that Koresh and the Davidians were aware of the impending raid, the siege proceeded. On the morning of the 28th of February, 1993, agents swarmed around the compound, but instead of being met with complacent religious folk, a heavy firefight ensued. The Davidians, backed by barricades, canned food, and a steady supply of ammo, had the advantage, allowing them to continue the standoff for days on end. The agents, on the other hand, were not so well equipped. Nonetheless, they stood in place, not willing to give up on their display of ATF confidence. For a harrowing 51 days, the Waco siege wore on. Tensions were at an all-time high, with FBI negotiators and hostage rescue teams being brought in. During those 51 days, exchanges of lead left several Davidians and some agents mortally wounded. One of Koresh's vintage cars was squashed by a tank, and bed sheets painted with messages were hung out of the compound's windows. When negotiations and attempts to de-escalate the situation failed, the tactical faction received approval to end the standoff more rapidly and more aggressively. After 51 days, on the 19th of April, federal agents penetrated the Mount Carmel compound by ramming into the building with tanks and pumping tear gas into every crevice they could find. This plan, of course, was flawed. Ramming the structure caused it to weaken, and the panic from within resulted in further slayings and the starting of a fire. Agents expected the Davidians to surrender, but this didn't happen. By the end of it, only 9 of the cult members emerged unscathed. The rest opted to remain within, either succumbing to smoke inhalation, being crushed by the building, or by their own hands. The 9 Davidians surrendered and were taken into custody, where they would be charged. As for Koresh, the government's hot-headed approach allowed him to transform into the martyr he always was. It was undoubtedly a catastrophic event, one disturbing enough to mar the history of the 1990s. In the lead-up to Halloween 1948, the residents of a small town in Pennsylvania lived through an event that resembled something from a horror movie. A thick smog settled over the population, obscuring everything in a mist that made regular life seem impossible. By the time it cleared, 20 people had lost their lives, and countless more were left with severe health problems. Donora was a mill town situated in a valley along the Monongahela River. most of the residents were in some way connected to the Donora zinc works and the American steel and wire plant. The industry kept the town alive financially, but it also pumped pollutants into the atmosphere and the environment. Around the zinc plant, all vegetation had been wiped out by the pollutants, but most residents saw it as the price they had to pay for the industry. On October 27, 1948, an unusual weather event reached the area. A temperature inversion meant a layer of warm air was trapping cold air beneath it. Also trapped were all the pollutants pumped out into the air, including those from the mills. At first, residents tried to continue their normal lives. The local high school played their weekly football game, and a Halloween parade took place. But it quickly became clear that this was no ordinary fog. Doctors started to receive calls from elderly people and people with health problems. They were finding it impossible to breathe and needed supplies of oxygen to survive. Doctors went from house to house as quickly as they could. Driving became impossible, and ambulances had to be guided by people walking ahead of them and carrying torches. The most vulnerable people were told to evacuate, but for many that simply wasn't an option. Even those who'd been healthy before the terrifying event found themselves becoming sick. On October 30th, the first 2 victims of the smog lost their lives. By the time the smog had cleared, another 18 people had also perished. Investigators found that the lungs of victims resembled survivors of poison weapon attacks. Among the pollutants trapped in the fog were sulfuric acid and nitrogen dioxide. In the first days of the smog, one of the few things that remained unaffected were the mills themselves. They continued to operate, even if most people realized that they were the source of the problem. On October 31st, a meeting took place between town officials and plant operators, asking for the mills to be shut down. The procedure for closing operations had already begun, but the plants wouldn't remain shut down for long. That same day, it began to rain. The new weather finally cleared the trapped cold air and the pollutants, and things finally began to return to normal. Number 9. Throughout human history, battles and wars have been decided by some unusual and disturbing moments. In 1360, it seemed like the fate of France was decided by a single freak weather incident. Over 30 years earlier, King Charles IV of France passed away without any male heirs. French law at the time forbade a woman from inheriting royal titles. The throne passed to a cousin of the late king, but he had a closer male relative, Edward III of England. Edward's claim to the throne was through his mother, Charles's sister. He argued that the law said nothing about titles passing through a female line, and he was the rightful ruler of France. It was this argument that in 1337 began the 100 Years' War. The first phase of the war had been a series of English victories. The English army had won battle after battle and actually captured the French king. In the autumn of 1359, Edward and his top generals crossed the English Channel to start another phase of the battles. The French did not want to meet the English in open battle and remained behind protective walls. That allowed the English to pillage the countryside and lay siege to important cities. In April of 1360, Edward's forces arrived outside Paris and laid siege to the capital, but there was no way they could defeat such a heavily fortified and well-stocked location. Instead, the army tore through Paris's suburbs and the surrounding countryside, burning and destroying everything they could on their way to a new location. That location was about 80 kilometers southwest of Paris. The army arrived on Easter Monday. Like in other cities, the French forces remained behind the city walls and refused to meet the English in open battle. The English army, made up of thousands of men and horses, made camp outside the walls and prepared for a siege. But before even the first night, the siege was open. Temperatures plummeted. The sky grew dark. Suddenly and without warning, balls of ice were falling from the sky. It was a freak storm, one nobody would have been able to predict in that era. Showers of hail battered the unprotected English soldiers and their horses. The stones were so large they significantly wounded both men and animals and sent those who were unharmed into a frenzy. Chronicles of the time report that at least 2 people were struck by lightning. The storm lasted just an hour, but when it passed, a disturbing and gruesome scene was left behind. The weather alone had been terrifying, but the terror had caused horses to stampede and wound countless people. An estimated 1,000 men had lost their lives, including some of Edward's most valuable generals. The army also had lost 6,000 horses. The war had been on for 23 years at this point and included countless battles. This single storm had been more costly than any of the previous fights. Number 8. The loss of the USS Akron was the biggest airship disaster in human history. Of the 76 people who were on board as it sailed over the Atlantic Ocean, only 3 survived the horrifying crash. The lessons learned in the tragedy went on to save lives in later disasters. The Akron was one of the largest flying structures ever built. It was 785 feet long, and when filled with helium, had a diameter of 133 feet. The ship was part of the U.S. Navy's fleet and served as a flying aircraft carrier. Since entering the service in 1931, it had been on many successful trips, including a cross-country flight. But that would all come to an end in April of 1933. The Akron's mission on April 3, 1933 was a simple one. It was supposed to fly in circles above New England to help calibrate radio signals in the area. Unfortunately, it quickly became clear that the mission would have to be put on hold. Severe weather conditions had moved in on the area, causing stormy weather and a few lightning strikes. There were other activities that the Akron crew would be doing in the meantime, and the captain ordered the ship southwards towards New Jersey to conduct those missions. But as the evening wore on, the weather only got worse and worse. The Akron had gone into battle with terrible weather conditions before and come out unscathed. Nobody on board had any reason to believe this night would be any different. At 9:46 p.m., the U.S. Navy Radio Service, the NAA, contacted the Akron to check in. The radio operator responded that he had nothing for them and there was nothing to worry about. Even as lightning struck close to the airship, the captain continued to calmly navigate through the storm. Shortly after midnight, disaster struck. The vessel suddenly struck turbulence and was buffeted around. The men aboard tried desperately to get the ship back under control as it was pushed lower and lower towards the surface of the ocean. Unfortunately, the devices that told sailors their exact altitude worked by measuring air pressure. The low pressure of the storm had decalibrated the devices, and the sailors would have no real idea just how high or low they were. That meant that when the captain ordered them higher, the ship didn't have enough vertical clearance to raise its nose. The tail of the Akron hit the water. Water entered the fin, and the entire ship was dragged down into the ocean. There was no way to recover. In a matter of minutes, one of the largest airships in the world was beneath the waves. Even though it was a Navy vessel designed to fly above the ocean, there were no life vests or boats on board. When the order was given to abandon ship, there was nowhere for any of the 76 men on board to go. Some clung to pieces of wreckage, others were trapped beneath the debris and sank along with the ship. A German merchant ship had spotted lights plummeting into the ocean and came to investigate. They found just 4 of the airmen and brought them aboard. At the time, they believed they'd come across a simple plane crash. It wasn't until one of the men regained consciousness that they realized the scale of the disaster. The ship returned to the scene of the disturbing event, but no more people could be rescued. Of the 4 people who were brought aboard, 1 didn't regain consciousness. An investigation into the disaster determined that the captain had made an error in navigation, but as he was lost in the crash, it was impossible to figure out exactly why he made the decisions that he did. Number 7. On the morning of March 21st, 1788, the people of New Orleans gathered around churches for Good Friday services. By the following morning, most had lost almost everything they owned in a devastating fire that wrecked through the city. New Orleans was Spain's colonial capital and had only grown in population and prestige over the decades since it was founded. Over 5,000 people called it their home. A writer at the time said the people of the city enjoyed more than the ordinary comforts of life, but they weren't without their problems. Residents had withstood 2 hurricanes, a bad winter, and a bad indigo harvest. Generally, though, things were good for New Orleans. But that would all change in just one horrifying day. A fire started at around 1:30 in the afternoon. According to all accounts, it began in the home of Don Vicente José Núñez, the Spanish royal treasurer. Exactly how the fire started isn't clear. One story comes from an Englishman riding home after witnessing the disturbing event. He claimed that Núñez was observing Good Friday worship at his home at a personal altar. He lit hundreds of candles and left them unattended. The flames caught on either the drapes or the ceiling and quickly spread. Most buildings in the area were made from wood, feeding the fire and helping it reach almost every block of the city. It wasn't an especially cold day, but there were significant winds that also helped embers jump from one building to another. There was little that any of the residents could do to put out the fire. Normally, the church bells would be used like a fire alarm, alerting the rudimentary fire services to the disaster. But according to some sources, the church ministers wouldn't let that happen on this day. It was forbidden by the Catholic Church for bells to be rung on Good Friday, and the church staff stood firm. The bells may not have made much difference. New Orleans was supposed to have a good supply of leather ladders and buckets, which would have been resistant to the blaze, but the recommendations weren't followed. For hours after the fire started, only a few buckets could be found. It wasn't nearly enough to quench the flames. There was no real organization. People struggled to collect as many of their possessions as possible, only to find that there was nowhere for them to go to keep those rescued items safe. Many people weren't able to save anything at all, and were left with little more than the clothes they were wearing when they escaped the burning streets. Records were also destroyed, including archives kept in the church and government buildings. Eventually, the fire was tamed. Of the roughly 11,000 buildings that had once stood in one of the largest cities in North America, around 800 had been reduced to rubble. They included the church, storehouses, and most residential buildings. Most of those that had been spared were those that sat along the Mississippi River. One of the few buildings that survived was the Royal Hospital. Despite the widespread devastation, most of the residents managed to survive the terrifying ordeal. The colonial government handed out tents to the homeless and rations of rice to anybody in need. It wasn't long before rebuilding work began within the city, although records show around 500 people left New Orleans for good after the disaster. Number 6. During the Cold War, it was rare for forces from the USSR and the United States to directly face off. One of the moments when this did happen took place in the Black Sea in 1988. For years, the United States military had been sending ships into the Black Sea and other areas where they believed navigation rights were being restricted. According to international law and agreements, every nation has the right to innocent passage through any other nation's territorial waters, with some restrictions. For the most part, those restrictions concern the security of the coastal nation. The traveling ship can't do anything that might threaten the safety of another nation. The law had been ratified in the 1950s, and both the United States and the USSR had signed up for it. But the United States soon found out that the USSR didn't entirely agree with what the US thought those restrictions were. The US worried that if it didn't regularly challenge the Soviets' interpretation by sending ships into Soviet waters, they would lose the rights granted by the law. A few times a year, military vessels would be sent through the Bosphorus Strait into the Black Sea to show the flag. Normally, this didn't cause any problems, but there had been incidents where Soviet vessels had tried to force American ships out of their own waters. In 1986, an American cruiser and destroyer were confronted by Soviet ships while exercising the right of innocent passage. The American ships spent a few hours in Soviet waters as they carried on along their route. After the incident, Soviet officials met to discuss what they would do if something similar happened again. One of the methods to drive foreign ships out of their own waters was to bump them, pushing against the foreign vessel with one of the USSR's own. That method was put into practice 2 years later. It was February 13, 1988, and the same two ships were back in the Black Sea. They were the cruiser, the USS Yorktown, and the destroyer, the USS Akron. As the two ships sailed through the Black Sea, they passed close to the Soviet shore. The Akron was less than 10 miles off the coast of Crimea, and Yorktown just a few miles further out. A Soviet frigate confronted the U.S. ships. Over the radio, the sailors warned that they had orders to prevent the violation of territorial waters, and authorization to strike the U.S. ships. The U.S. vessels continued on like normal. Sailors aboard the Karen responded that they were simply engaging in innocent passage, consistent with international law. Just a few minutes after radio contact was made, the Soviet frigate came alongside the Yorktown and pushed against the U.S. ship. Another vessel did the same to the Karen. Neither vessel received much damage, and they were able to continue, but the so-called bumping incident left a message. The two nations finally came together to resolve the issue. They found that the problem lay in the different versions of the law that both had ratified. According to the law written in Russian, nations had the right to regulate the right to innocent passage. For the USSR, that meant restricting it to designated waterways. There were no such waterways in the Black Sea, but the English language version of the law had no such regulation. The following year, a joint statement was signed between the two nations, making sure another confrontation wouldn't happen. Number 5. In 1952, the world witnessed the first ever major nuclear reactor accident. A meltdown at an experimental facility in Canada almost led to disaster, but the quick work of the staff on site stopped the worst from happening. The Chalk River Laboratories is a nuclear research facility located around 180 kilometers northwest of Ottawa, along the banks of the Ottawa River. The facility has operated various reactors since 1944 and is mostly used for research purposes. It's also provided radioactive isotopes for the medical industry. One of the earliest reactors on the site was the NRX, a nuclear research reactor designed to provide new insights into a technology that was rapidly developing. The reactor opened in 1947 and ran many successful experiments until the disastrous day in December of 1952. It was about 3 p.m. on December 12th. After a day of testing, scientists were getting ready for the final experiment of the day. Parts of the reactor were hooked up to alternative cooling systems, and it was only expected to run on lower power for the duration of the test. As the experiment was underway, an operator in the facility's basement noticed something he thought was odd. Some valves appeared to be in the wrong direction. He adjusted them, changing the air pressure in the reactor and causing some control rods to rise out of the reactor. It was only a matter of seconds before the supervisor in the control room realized what had happened. He telephoned the basement, ordered the operator to stop immediately, and then went down to readjust the valves himself. Adjusting the valves should have been enough for the control rods to slide back into place. The rods moved a little, enough that the red warning lights switched off, but they didn't lodge completely into place. With the control rods out of place, the temperature in the reactor was rising rapidly. There was no way to fix the problem from the basement, but it needed to be fixed quickly. The supervisor called one of the operators back in the control room, instructing him on which button to press to get the rods back into place. Unfortunately, he told the operator to push the first and fourth buttons, rather than the third and fourth. The operator put the phone down to rush and carry out the instructions, just as the supervisor realized his mistake and tried to correct himself. It was too late. Rather than using a pneumatic system to push the rods back into place, 4 more control rods had been released. Temperatures within the reactor were now doubling every 2 seconds. It only took about 14 seconds for operators to realize what had happened and flood the reactor with heavy water, but it had already become hot enough to melt fuel rods. To make matters worse, there was a problem with the pressure related to the helium in the reactor, and air flooded in. When the helium and oxygen mixed, it caused a blast that damaged the reactor and caused cooling water to flood the facility. The entire chain of events happened in just over a minute. Radioactive particles had been sent into the air, but the main concern after the disaster was the contaminated water that now pooled in the facility. Letting the radioactive water seep out into the environment could have caused an ecological disaster. Cleanup teams had to move fast to stop that from happening, but the facility was so radioactive that they could only work for short periods of time. Canadian and U.S. military personnel helped in the cleanup. Among those was future U.S. President Jimmy Carter. Water was pumped into sandbanks where it could be filtered before entering the rivers, and the damaged fuel rods and parts of the reactor were also just buried. It would be years before the NRX was operational again, but for the most part, there doesn't appear to have been any significant long-term impacts from the disaster. Number 4. For 8 years in the early 15th century, people living in the small canton of Valet at the base of the Matterhorn were gripped by fear and paranoia. If the results of trials were to be believed, hundreds of evil people lived among them, stealing wine, attacking livestock, and even cursing other people with ill health. The Valet witch trials were the first of their kind. Exactly how many people lost their lives after being accused of witchcraft is unknown. Estimates range from 1 to 200, but the disturbing event went on to inspire and influence witch trials throughout the rest of Europe and beyond. The trials began in 1428 in the Swiss-speaking half of Valet and quickly spread to other parts of the region. The area had been going through a lot of political instability for years before the accusations of witchcraft began. There had recently been a rebellion against the ruling family. The rebellion failed, but it put more pressure on judges to tackle crime, which meant they acted quickly when accusations were made. Unlike more famous witch trials in history, exactly how the Valet trials began is a mystery. But when delegates from several districts came together in August of 1428, the decision showed just what was needed for an accusation to be taken seriously. All it took was a person to be accused of witchcraft by 3 or more neighbors before they were arrested. In Valet, an arrest was as good as a conviction. People who were arrested could either confess to their crimes right away or be tortured until a confession was given. Either case would result in the supposed witch losing their life. The most gruesome punishment involved being tied to a ladder and lowered into flames. The crimes of witches ranged from simply stealing wine from cellars to cannibalism. According to various confessions, the witches would gather in wine cellars where they were visited by the devil in disguise as a school teacher. He would teach them witchcraft and give them instructions on avoiding mass and confession. The witches would confess to good deeds they had done in mockery of the church proceedings. Many of the crimes seemed to be nothing more than people looking for an explanation to natural misfortune. Farmers would notice that their cows were not producing as much milk as before, and accuse their neighbors of magically stealing the milk. Unlike in more famous trials, roughly 2/3 of the people accused were men. Most of the victims were peasants, and their names were never recorded, but some of the accused were members of nobility. If the victim's family could prove they had no knowledge of the witchcraft, their possessions would be returned to them after the trial. If not, they were given to members of the nobility. After 8 years, tensions in Valet started to dissipate. The last of the witch trials took place around 1436 or 1438, but the disturbing moment had ignited a fear of witchcraft throughout the rest of Europe, which would continue for decades to come. Number 3. One of the most disturbing moments in human history was a simple misunderstanding that almost ended the world. It was November 1983. Cold War tensions had risen to the highest levels since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Speeches made by U.S. President Ronald Reagan made the Soviet Union believe that a war could start at any moment. What was worse, they believed that the U.S. could launch nuclear weapons with almost no warning. By the time the USSR realized what was going on, they would have minutes to react. Systems were in place to make sure any signs of an imminent attack were spotted before it was too late. Spies in Western countries were ordered to report on anything from changes in the routines of government officials to extra lights being left on in government buildings. The USSR had early warning systems in place to detect launches, but they weren't without faults. Just a few weeks earlier, in September of 1983, one system had alerted a Soviet Air Defense Force officer that a nuclear weapon had been launched from the West. He disobeyed instructions to pass the information up the chain of command and waited for more information. Thankfully, it was nothing but a mistake by the system, and a crisis was averted. But the Soviet government did not relax, and it would take more than one cool head to stop the next close call from triggering World War III. For years, NATO allies had run annual war games to prepare for if the Cold War became hot. One of these exercises was Able Archer, which practiced command and control procedures. In this exercise, there were no actual troops on the ground, but there'd been in previous exercises during the games. Instead, commanders in remote locations communicated through coded messages, moving imaginary troops into various positions. In the exercise, a change of command in the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, joining the NATO alliance, had caused the USSR to invade Western European countries. The NATO forces went through all the stages of the DEFCON system before a nuclear launch was simulated. This wasn't the first time Able Archer had been run, but there were key differences in the 1983 version of the game. Coded communications were used for the first time. This was also the first time the whole DEFCON system had been rehearsed. From the perspective of the USSR, it was a very realistic rehearsal. The war games were not a secret. The Soviet government was aware that they were taking place. Rather than mistaking a simple training exercise for the real event, the Soviet government worried that Operation Able Archer was being used to cover up actual preparations for a nuclear attack. With the coded messages and some of the most important military officers involved in the games, it would be easy for actual commands to be hidden behind the fake ones. What looked like real nuclear warheads had also been spotted during an earlier exercise. They were fake, but it was almost impossible for the Soviet government to tell. The USSR's nuclear forces were put on high alert. Nuclear submarines were sent under the Arctic ice to hide from sonar and radar systems. Planes in Poland and East Germany were loaded with destructive weapons. If the September false alarm had happened just a few weeks later, it's possible that even a single nuclear weapon being spotted would have been taken seriously. Thankfully, Operation Able Archer ended without disaster. In fact, the US forces didn't realize just how close they'd come to triggering an actual nuclear war. Even when a KGB defector told British intelligence about the Russian war scare, the US didn't believe that the Soviet Union actually believed it would strike first. It wasn't until years later that they realized it had not been a bluff, and a simple misunderstanding almost ended all life as we know it. Number 2. The Cadaver Synod was one of the strangest moments in medieval history. Pope Formosus was put on trial for perjury and disobeying the rules of the Catholic Church. This alone was strange enough, but the fact that Formosus had passed away months earlier made it a disturbing moment. Formosus ruled as pope from October 891 to August of 896. It was a tumultuous time in the Catholic Church and in Europe as a whole. The Church was averaging about a pope a year, with some only lasting a few months before passing away through natural or unnatural means. The close ties between the Church and the Holy Roman Empire meant that Church officials were brought into political battles between various factions. Only the Pope could crown a Holy Roman Emperor, but that inevitably meant making enemies with other powerful families that were vying for the throne. For Formosus, that enemy was the Spoleto family. Guy III of Spoleto was the Holy Roman Emperor when Formosus became Pope, but Formosus didn't trust him. The emperor had a lot of power in Italy and forced Formosus to crown his son as co-emperor, but Formosus fought back by inviting one of Spoleto's enemies to invade Italy. Arnulf of Carinthia invaded twice, once before Guy III passed away and once afterwards. After the second invasion, Formosus crowned Arnulf as Holy Roman Emperor. Fighting between various Italian states continued through the rest of Formosus's reign, and the Pope took sides like any other local ruler. In April of 896, Formosus passed away. His successor ruled for only 15 days before he also succumbed to disease. In May of 1896, Stephen VI became Pope. Stephen had to deal with the same political problems as his predecessors. Historians have debated whether he always was a supporter of the Spoletos, or if he switched allegiances when it became clear the sick emperor wouldn't be able to protect him from the Spoleto forces. Whichever was the case, Stephen soon made it clear who his allegiances were now with. Stephen wanted to discredit everything Formosus had done as Pope, particularly the crowning of Arnulf. To do that, he put the Pope on trial. While he was still a bishop, Formosus had come up against the church authorities and was actually excommunicated at one point. With the head of the church changing so often, it wasn't long before this decision had been undone, allowing him to ascend to the chair of St. Peter. But Stephen argued this was a mistake. To put Formosus on trial, his body was dug up and placed on a throne, where a deacon was appointed to keep him upright and to respond on his behalf. According to accounts, there was little chance for that to happen. Stephen served as a prosecutor and judge and spoke passionately and at length as he made accusations of perjury and lies. He claimed Formosus had served as a bishop in 2 places at once, had served as a layman, and had conspired to usurp the papacy. Formosus, or the deacon speaking on his behalf, had little opportunity to do anything but offer a simple denial. Unsurprisingly, Formosus was found guilty of the crimes. 3 fingers were removed from his body, the 3 used during life to give blessings. He was buried in a grave for foreigners before his body was disinterred again and thrown into the Tiber River. Fishermen found the remains, and monks secretly reburied him in a monastery. Number 1. In 1979, one of the biggest releases of radioactive material in human history took place in the United States. It occurred just 4 months after the 3 Mile Island disaster, but has mostly been forgotten. The site of the disaster was Church Rock, New Mexico. For decades, uranium mines were in operation around the region, often on or near Navajo Nation land. The mines were important sources of materials for both nuclear weapons and power plants, but the people working in them weren't properly informed of the risks they were taking. The mines themselves often didn't prioritize the safety of their workers or the surrounding environment. One of the biggest examples of this was the tailings pond from a mill operated by the United Nuclear Corporation. The pond was an area where mine waste was dumped. Much of it was radioactive. The purpose was for water within the waste to evaporate, leaving behind a solid substance that could then be buried. Millions of gallons of waste were held in the pond, the southern wall of which was made up of an earthen dam. There was no protective layer between the ponds and the ground, and little to prevent the radioactive material from leaking into the environment. For years, there had been a slow release of radioactivity into the ground and the water, but the disaster of July 16, 1979 was much worse. Years earlier, workers at the site had noticed cracks beginning to form in the dam walls. They informed their superiors, but nothing was done. A few weeks before the disaster, the issue was raised again. A worker noticed cracks the size of fists within the wall. Again, the mine operators were informed, but again, nothing was done. At 5:30 a.m. on July 16th, those cracks became a 20-foot breach in the dam. The millions of gallons of waste held back by the dam were now free to spill out into the surrounding area. Much of it made its way onto Navajo land, and then into waterways leading to Puerco River. It was 30 minutes before the breach was noticed by mine staff, and discharge into the pond was stopped. A temporary dam was put into place by 8 a.m., but by this point, 94 million gallons of tailing solution had been released. At the time, it was the largest accidental release of radioactive material in history. Since then, it's only been surpassed by the Chernobyl and Fukushima plant accidents. Witness reported children who played in the water coming home with burns on their feet, but the people living in the area weren't immediately informed of the danger, and it wasn't until the following day that this process began. People were told not to drink from the river or to allow their animals to do so. In this arid region of New Mexico, many people didn't have a choice. Navajo officials asked the state government to declare a federal disaster area. Aid was limited, and attention was even more so. Compared to the 3 Mile Island disaster, the Church Rock spill received almost no media attention. Newspaper reports simply stated that the area was sparsely populated, and repeated statements saying that the spill had little impact. Official investigations took place and found there was little danger to the people or animals living in the region, just a short time after the disaster. They claimed that most of the contaminated water and sediments had been washed away or diluted. But Native Americans living in the region have argued that there's been an increase in diseases and health problems since the disaster. Many of those problems may have originated with ordinary mining operations, which resumed shortly after the disaster took place. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.